that's as far as I got. And developing thoughts on Gabaji and stuff like that actually transfers over into some of my own just fan work with the old RuneQuest, which you can see if you check out some of my files for that stuff. And one might also note that the term Urbaja in my game Circle of Hands, which is not an ambiguous force in any way, shape, or form, um, clearly has, its roots in the word Gabaji. So, therefore, um, I can't speak a whole lot regarding personal play. What does interest me is what Margaret has pointed out, that in Hero Quest role playing in Glorantha, and I believe that this may be followed through in later publications, the modern RuneQuest. I'm kind of staying out of that whole canonical New Glorantha thing, so someone else will have to look that up for their own purposes. But there it is, 5 Arcats Return. Now, this game is set later than the original game was set. The Hero Wars are well underway, and all sorts of mythic stuff has just boomed into reality, rather than kind of, that could happen one day feeling. And the notion that the 5 incarnations of Arcat would return, and as it says, at war with each other and with himself, as it puts it, and with everyone else. Well, that's exciting. Don't really know what to do with it. They definitely have a more broad geographic approach to Glorantha in this and later material, so that Rallios and those areas, those Men of the West areas, are now purported to have as much identity as Dragon Pass, although frankly I've never really found anything about anywhere else in Glorantha quite to have the same heft, the same potential as the Dragon Pass region in the texts. But whatever, I mean, it's there as role-playing space now, I guess. So yes, the notion of it being imminent for play, but does that ever really happen? That's one thing I never really managed to pick up. I at least don't really get much of a feel for play, except for Dragon Pass even to this day, and particularly as modified through the 90s, particularly from the computer game, where it's given much more of a Celtic/Saxon feel. And I'm not very interested in that. But that does seem to be, at least in play reports, that particular interpretation of the setting seems to be where everybody plays. But maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe there is, a game set in that point in the map where the arrow is pointing, and the 5 Arcats are rife, and all of the magic and stuff like that is all wrapped up in that conflict. I've kind of fallen out of being excited about this anymore for purposes of practical play. I'd have to probably create a bubble where I hold up these books and say, hey, let's play some RuneQuest or Hero Wars and do whatever we will with it. And who cares what, modern play culture or any other text has to say about it. And we would just start with that stuff. But if anybody has played Arcat, Nicelor, Gabaji content in modern play, I'd sure like to know about it. Just out of curiosity, what are you doing with it? Because it still seems to me, very modern text, I don't know, putting those aside, it still seems to me that it's open. It's wide open. The way you do it, what it means, what it's for, its mythic power, the nature of the adventures or events of play that arise from that context, they just seem so wide open. And I'd love to know what people do with it. Much like Margaret did, and the people she played with did regarding Esrolia, in much the same way. All right, second question from Alessio, who says something very kind here. It says he found my Patreon post. I found your Patreon post about situated characters extremely enlightening, which I'm glad. I mean, I hope so, and I'm glad it was good for people. It says, Alessio says, it helped me diagnosing an issue I have while playing characters. While I'm extremely comfortable and natural playing characters in a whoever type situation, I struggle playing characters in a relevant type situation. Okay, let's clarify what I'm talking about. If you haven't seen that Patreon post, and the terminology is deliberately, rough and kind of shaky, actually. What I mean by a whoever situation means that relevant aspects of the situation of play have been created with no reference whatsoever to what kind of player characters are coming in. Aside from their eligibility to be playing in this game at all, there is no looking at the character sheets and then saying other things about the situation that are going to be present because of that. So that's what I mean by whoever. If I'm making those other relevant parts of the situation for play, I'm not looking at anything about the characters. Characters are, made up, or maybe they already exist, or whatever, but they're going to show up, and whatever interplay occurs among these different elements will be there in play. Trollbabe is an excellent example. Circle of Hands is another. Now, way far at the other end, we have what I, humorously refer to as solipsistic play, where the relevant of elements of the scenario, or the vast majority of them, don't come from anywhere else. So you're looking across the character sheets and you see all these things. And if you're responsible for coming up with external elements of the scenario that characters will be dealing with, well, you're getting most of it off of those very sheets. So, as I like to say, and play really is, the literal warp and woof of the world that the characters are walking and talking in is all about them, or at least creatively, that's where it's come from. So in between, either there's a spectrum in there, which is just a spectrum between the two with no discernible, points of any identity, or there's kind of a category in the middle, perhaps, procedurally speaking at least, in which we look at the relevant elements of play and we say, oh, look, there is an interplay and between the character content and other external content, and they kind of, chunk together for what makes this situation. Now, remember, all play does that. All play. The characters are part of the situation. Don't mistake situation for prepared scenario. That's not the same thing. I'm talking about a play phenomenon that I call situation. So all of them have characters running around in it as part of it by definition. That's not what I mean. What I'm talking about is the creative process of getting, these things together. And so is there some kind of formal or identifiable thing in which what the player characters are is relevant to what has been prepared, but there's also other things that have nothing to do with them that are also relevant, and it's not just a spectrum between those two extremes? Well, I don't really know, but if there is, I called it relevant. In other contexts, I refer to as dynamic. We don't really know just how those things, punch together until we do it. But anyways, Alessio is saying somewhere in the middle, if it is indeed a middle and not a third category, and if it is a third category in there, that's where he says, I struggle playing characters in a relevant type scenario. In particular, he goes on, I'm not very good at reincorporating the elements that a game master or whoever has this task in the specific game puts in the situation from my background. So he's made up a character background. He's handed this over to a game master or whatever, and then they put that material in. And then he's saying that when he's playing, he actually isn't, interacting with that. Reincorporating is a very specific term here. It means that what someone else says in the context of what I call the authorities, someone else then says in the context of their authorities. So, the game master says that there's a sword in the chest, and you say, I pick up the sword, right? That's reincorporation. Very simple example, super important. And Alessio goes on, he says, I simply interact with the situation, ignoring that perhaps the game master has inserted elements for my character. So any suggestions to improve my ability to reincorporate elements that the GM facilitator has put from my background in this kind of situation. There's a piece of the way this question is being asked that can be broken and rebuilt. And I think that then leads us to the answer. Because we have here, in the way that Alessio is stating it, a somewhat disjointed or stepwise aspect to it that is a little too transitive. The idea being that I have in the background of my character that, bandits murdered my father, and I'm all broken up about it, and I've got issues. Perhaps those issues aren't stated. Perhaps it's just a line on the sheet, or maybe there's a whole paragraph and 20 other things on the sheet are all, spun in this context, whichever. But the point is, it's there. The game master, in a situation that is not wholly built or very almost entirely built from such content from all the sheets, therefore has content that they are dragging in for their own excitement, their own purposes, their own presentation, that we don't know about perhaps, or will be learning about very quickly. But as well, there may be pieces or parts that are coming from the sheets too. Now, I think we'll all recognize that. I think we've all done this. So, we know this happens. I'm not saying, this is weird. What I'm interested in is the idea that Alessio's phrasings imply to me that once I put it on my sheet, I kind of go dark now. And the game master now has this material and says, so this will be in this scenario. Now, procedurally, this isn't quite off. It's when it hits play that model gets weird. The idea that the player has still gone dark about that material, has still basically dropped it. And it will be in play when the game master puts it in play, as if kind of saying, see, here it is, here's your thing, and you're supposed to get excited about it and go running toward it. This is what they used to call flags in the post-Forge or late Forge story games dialogues, and I thought it was completely off base because it's on your sheet. Even if it's not mentioned by the game master, your character makes perfectly good sense to be asking about, the bandits. Have they come through here? I'm interested in the bandits. They killed my father, or whatever. Even if they're not very vocal about it, the character is still active in this regard. This is a piece of what you made up about the character, and your character is concerned about it. So that concern is part of the situation. If it doesn't directly involve other aspects of the situation that you're encountering, the fact that your character is like this, cares about it, and says, oh, no bandits around here? They didn't come through here. They went off to the east. Well, we're going off to the east sooner or later, everybody. Yeah, I know. We have problems here, and I'm curious about all that and everything, but they went off to the east. We're going there after. So even if it's not immediately part of this, they're involved. You made up this character who's all about this, so you are actually important in its presence in the situation. It's having gone dark about it for purposes of play is an artifact perhaps of having said, okay, well, the game master has authority over whether these bandits are even in the situation. And if they are, when they show up and say, we got your dad, you're next, or whatever it is the bandits are about. And you just go dark until that happens. You don't play your character as involved regarding the bandits. That seems curiously passive and weird to me. And I know it happens. So those judgmental statements are not because I'm so above it all. Those judgmental statements are now looking at it and saying, look at that. We do that sometimes. We make up cool stuff and then it's passed over to the game master. And then we just kind of go dark about it. And why bother engaging with it if it does show up in play? Because it's just trouble. I mean, you made me write that shit down and now you're going to use it against me. Well, I'm just, what's the real problem here? We got to find the MacGuffin. Look, I'm just all about the MacGuffin. Bandits, whatever. That's kind of an extreme way to put it, or maybe it's just that somehow the giving up of it as part of the scenario creation has also basically turned into internally this notion that you've given up on it as a proactive piece of play for yourself. That's what I'm talking about. That seems to be where the question is itself broken. And if we repair that and say, yes, you gave up the authoritative use of those components to the game master, but not your character's commitment to it as part of their personality or their relevance to their life, that is not gone from your hands. That you're playing this person relative to that content, just like the game master is playing their characters and other aspects of the situation as relevant to that content to whatever degree, is part of play. It's part of what we do here. And I think that I may be, if I am entirely off base, so Alessio, if I am entirely off base in interpreting your question and claiming that it needs to be broken and I totally misunderstood the whole thing, and I'm, dissing, you by saying this, then let me know and we'll start over again so I understand it better. But if I'm kind of understanding it from the way it's phrased, then I think that's where we need to go to address this notion that you go into play kind of, with your knife and fork and see what the game master has served up, is where the issue lies. That the generation of content is one thing. That's who makes it up. Development of it prior to play is another issue. Who works it up a little bit more, if they do. Its relevance to the circumstances of play. That's another issue. And that relevance to the circumstances of play is not just that one person who has the authoritative use of those things in play. They're not the only person who has authoritative use. Your character's attitude toward it is under your authoritative use. And so therefore it's relevant, it's present in the situation, even just as a passing reference. Because that's who you're playing. That's what you're doing here. So doesn't mean your character is monomaniacal, but a passing reference is real. Particularly if other people, reincorporate as well. They recognize that your character is about that. Maybe they then operate off that knowledge of your character. When that happens across different people playing, it turns the whole thing from everybody sitting there individually with their knife and fork to see what each plate that the game master serves up in front of them individually has on it. No, we're talking to each other too. Reincorporation is more than just my guy, GM, my guy, for each person individually. With any luck, that helps create some context about this, especially in terms of the situation and story course that Alessio is in. And we can develop this further through more discussion, for sure. I may actually pull that Patreon post out of the Patreon and into Adept's Play for reference and development in the general public space.